As a new adaptation of Anne of Green Gables comes to CBC, its creators say audiences should expect, believe it or not, the grit of cable dramas. The new show arrives as another adaptation is already airing.
Forget everything you think you know about the sweet girl from Green Gables. When Netflix reimagined Anne Shirley's world, they didn't just add a bit of drama, they shattered the porcelain perfection of the original story.
It doesn't make sense that girls aren't allowed to do farm work when girls can do anything a boy can do, and more.
I knew Matthew was up to some foolishness.
Marilla, look at the puffs.
They're ridiculous.
Fans expected white picket fences and raspberry cordial. Instead, they got a gritty, forbidden look into trauma, social scandals, and the dark underbelly of the 1890s. From suppressed histories to scenes that felt too real for TV, let's unmask the secrets the show didn't want to sugarcoat. The Ghost in the Attic, Trauma and Flashbacks. When you pick up a copy of Lucy Maud Montgomery's classic novel, you're greeted with a world of kindred spirits and shining waters. The original Anne Shirley was definitely a survivor, but her trauma was mostly tucked away behind a curtain of flowery adjectives and high-spirited chatter. She'd mention a hard life with the Hammonds or the Thomas family, but the reader was allowed to keep their rose-colored glasses on. Then came the Netflix series, and suddenly, those glasses weren't just removed, they were smashed. The showrunners decided that if we were going to love Anne, we had to truly understand the ghosts that lived inside her head. This wasn't just a stylistic choice. It was a total reimagining of her character as a victim of severe PTSD, and the scenes they used to illustrate it felt, for many, like forbidden territory. The most jarring of these scenes involves the dead mouse incident. In a visceral, gray-toned flashback, we see a younger, smaller Anne at the orphanage. She isn't talking about the Lake of Shining Waters here. Instead, she is surrounded by a circle of cruel, desperate children who have caught a mouse. They don't just play with it, they kill it right in front of her. The message they give her is bone-chilling. It squeaked too much, just like you. They tell her that if she doesn't shut her mouth, she'll be next. For fans who grew up with the 1985 miniseries where the biggest threat was a smacked slate over Gilbert Blythe's head, this was a total system shock. It was a taboo look at the reality of 19th-century orphanages that the original books simply skipped over to keep the tone light and whimsical. But the show didn't stop at the orphanage. It took us into the homes where Anne was used as unpaid labor. We see scenes of Anne being screamed at, pushed, and witness to domestic violence. In one particularly haunting sequence, her foster father, Mr. Hammond, collapses and dies of a heart attack while in the middle of a violent, drunken rage. Anne isn't just a bystander. She is the one scrubbing the floors while he screams, the one caring for a literal army of infants while she herself is starving for affection. By showing these scenes, the Netflix series was making a bold statement. Anne's imagination wasn't just a quirky personality trait, it was a survival mechanism. She didn't talk to her reflection in the glass because she was enchanted. She did it because she was desperately lonely and trying to escape a reality that was too painful to inhabit. This shift in perspective is what makes these scenes feel so off to the traditionalist. There is a silent agreement in classic children's literature that we don't look too closely at the scars. By bringing the scars into the light, the show forced us to realize that Anne wasn't just a spunky girl. She was a traumatized child who was one bad day away from a total mental breakdown. The no-go nature of these scenes comes from the fact that they strip away the Victorian politeness. We see the dirt under her fingernails, the bruises on her arms, and the hollow look in her eyes during her quiet moments. Critics argued that this was too dark for a story about a girl with red braids. They felt that by focusing on the trauma, the show lost the magic of Green Gables. But the show's defenders argue the opposite, that the magic is actually more impressive when you realize what Anne overcame to find it. This tension is exactly why these scenes are talked about in hushed tones. They represent a bridge between the idealized past we like to imagine and the brutal reality that actually existed for children without families. It's the difference between a fairy tale and a documentary. When Anne has a panic attack because a man raises his voice, or when she freezes at the sight of a rat, the audience is forced to confront a version of Anne Shirley that isn't a kindred spirit. She's a human being who has been broken and is trying to glue the pieces back together. These scenes were the first sign that this wasn't your grandmother's Anne of Green Gables, and they set the stage for every other forbidden topic the show would eventually tackle. But the ghosts of Anne's past weren't the only thing haunting the quiet town of Avonlea. Her unfiltered honesty about the human body was about to create a whole new kind of scandal. The Birds and the Bees in 1890. Loss of innocence. In the world of classic literature, there is a certain hush-hush atmosphere surrounding anything remotely related to how the world actually works. For a long time, the original Anne of Green Gables existed in a state of perpetual springtime, where babies were brought by storks, and the concept of the birds and the bees was buried under layers of petticoats and lace. However, the Netflix series decided to pull back that curtain, and it did so in a way that felt absolutely scandalous to the conservative residents of Avonlea, and even to some modern viewers. This part of the story deals with a controversial truth, that Anne, because of her upbringing in homes with revolving doors of infants and struggling parents, knew way too much for a girl of her age. The scene that really set tongues wagging involves Anne sitting down with her schoolmates and explaining the mechanics of reproduction. To Anne, this wasn't dirty or prohibited information. It was just a fact of life she had observed while being a mother's helper for the overworked Mrs. Hammond and Mrs. Thomas. She had seen the struggle, the pain, and the biological reality of childbirth and what led up to it. When she shares this with the sheltered girls of Avonlea, girls like Diana Barry, who were raised to believe that everything about the body was a deep, dark secret, the reaction is one of pure horror. To the town, Anne wasn't just being informative. She was being ruined and indecent. This moment highlights a massive cultural gap. Anne's forbidden knowledge was a badge of her poverty and her lack of a traditional protected childhood. What makes this part so engaging is how the show handles the fallout. This wasn't just a funny misunderstanding like the raspberry cordial incident from the books. This had real-world consequences for Marilla Cuthbert. Suddenly, Marilla is being judged by the progressive mothers of the town. She is told that she is unfit to raise a girl if she allows her to speak of such vile things. This scene forces the audience to look at the hypocrisy of the Victorian era. The adults all knew how babies were made, obviously, but the almost banned part was acknowledging it out loud, especially to a child. By having Anne speak the truth, the show unmasks the fake modesty of the time. It shows that the innocence the town valued was actually just a form of enforced ignorance. Furthermore, this storyline touches on the idea of female education and bodily autonomy long before those were mainstream concepts. Anne's curiosity about her own body and the way she discusses it with her friends turns into a forbidden act of rebellion. The showrunners use this to contrast Anne's wild nature with the tame expectations of a Victorian lady. In the books, Anne's mistakes were usually about social etiquette, using liniment instead of vanilla, or dyeing her hair green. In the Netflix version, her mistakes are about breaking social taboos that are much more deeply rooted in the patriarchy. When we talk about awful scenes, this sequence stands out because it makes the viewer uncomfortable for a different reason than the trauma flashbacks. It makes us uncomfortable because we realize how much power was held over young women by keeping them in the dark about their own biology. Anne's forbidden knowledge was actually a source of power, even if she didn't know it yet. It allowed her to see through the romance and poetry that the other girls obsessed over and see the messy human reality underneath. It was a bold move for the show to take a character as pure as Anne Shirley and give her this kind of grounded, earthy awareness. It stripped away the pixie archetype and replaced it with a girl who had seen the world in all its raw, unpolished glory. This one serves as a bridge between the physical trauma of her past and the social battles she would face in her future, proving that in Avonlea the truth was often the most intriguing thing of all. While talking about the mysteries of life was enough to get Anne shunned by the local mothers, a darker, more dangerous lesson about power and consent was about to tear the town's social fabric apart. The barn dance betrayal. If there is one storyline that truly defines the Netflix era of Anne with an E, it is the tragic and infuriating arc of Billy Andrews and Josie Pye. In the original books, Billy was little more than a background character, a clumsy, thick-headed boy who served as a brief, unwanted suitor for Anne. Josie Pye, meanwhile, was the classic mean girl of the schoolroom, a shallow antagonist whose biggest crime was being vain and snarky. But the series took these two archetypes and thrust them into a plot involving sexual consent and public shaming that felt so modern it was almost jarring. This wasn't just a scene. It was a scandalous exploration of gender power dynamics that forced the audience to confront the ugly roots of sexual harassment culture in a 19th century setting. The scene takes place during a local barn dance, a setting that usually represents community, music, and wholesome fun. However, for Josie Pye, it becomes the site of a life-altering trauma. Billy Andrews, the golden boy of a powerful local family, takes Josie outside under the guise of romance. In the shadows, the atmosphere shifts from flirtatious to predatory. Billy pressures Josie to go further than she is comfortable with. And when she asserts her boundaries and says no, he doesn't just back off, he retaliates. In his mind, his ego is bruised, and in the world of Avonlea, a bruised male ego is often healed by destroying a girl's reputation. What follows is a sequence of events that felt different because it was so painfully realistic. Billy returns to the dance and begins whisper campaigning, telling his friends that Josie was easy and that she had begged for his attention. This is a classic narrative, the victim being painted as the aggressor. Because Billy is a boy from a good family, the town believes him. Josie, who was already somewhat disliked for her prickly personality, is immediately cast out. The scene where she walks through the school hallway the next day, feeling the weight of every judgmental stare and every muffled giggle, is a masterclass in psychological horror. It captures the feeling of being watched by an entire community that has already decided you are soiled goods. Anne, ever the champion of justice, refuses to stay silent. This leads to the forbidden editorial she writes for the school newspaper. Anne doesn't just defend Josie. She writes an impassioned, proto-feminist manifesto about bodily autonomy. She argues that a woman's body is her own and that a woman has a right to her own self. To a modern audience, this sounds like common sense, but in the context of the 1890s, these were dangerous words. The reaction from the town elders is swift and violent. They see Anne's words not as a defense of a girl's honor, but as a vile attack on the moral order of society. This eventually leads to a scene that felt like a literal funeral for free speech. The town leaders burning down the school's printing press to stop Anne's ideas from spreading. This storyline was deeply controversial among fans. Many argued that it was too modern and that a girl like Anne Shirley would never have had the language to discuss consent in such a clinical, political way. But the weird allure of this part lies in the fact that these issues did exist back then. People just weren't allowed to talk about them. By giving Anne the voice to speak up, the show broke the silence that has historically surrounded the mistreatment of young women. It showed that Josie Pye's meanness was often a shield she used to protect herself in a world that saw her only as an object to be won or a reputation to be ruined. The scene of the printing press fire serves as a powerful metaphor for the unique nature of the show itself. Just as the town tried to burn away Anne's radical ideas, many traditionalists wanted to burn away the grit of the Netflix series to get back to the pure Anne. But by showing the Billy and Josie incident, the show made it impossible to look at Avonlea the same way again. It proved that behind the quaint cottages and the flower gardens, there were stories of pain and injustice that were just waiting for someone brave enough to write them down. This part right here didn't just add drama, it added a layer of necessary, uncomfortable truth that made the stakes of Anne's life feel higher than ever before. As the fires of censorship smoldered in the town square, an even deeper, darker secret was being hidden just beyond the woods, a forbidden history that the creators of the show felt could no longer remain in the shadows. The stolen children. If there is one part of Anne with an E that truly fits the definition of forbidden, it is the storyline of Coquette. For over a century, the story of Anne Shirley was a celebration of Canadian identity, a lighthouse of charm and nostalgia for the Great White North. But the creators of the Netflix series decided that you couldn't tell a story about Canadian history in the 1890s without acknowledging the truth of how that country treated its Indigenous people. By introducing Coquette, a Mi'kmaq girl who becomes Anne's kindred spirit, the show ventured into a dark historical reality that had been effectively erased from previous adaptations. This wasn't just a sad subplot, it was an indictment of a national crime. The scenes in this arc are some of the most difficult to watch in the entire series. We see Coquette, full of curiosity and potential, being encouraged by her parents to attend a government-run school so she can learn the ways of the changing world. The moment she arrives at the residential school, the atmosphere shifts from a story of education to a story of incarceration. The scenes that follow are visceral, Coquette being forcibly scrubbed, her traditional clothing taken and burned, and her long hair, a symbol of her heritage and spirit, being chopped off by nuns as she screams in terror. For a show that started with a girl talking to trees, this was an absolute descent into the horrors of history. The series went even further by showing the physical and psychological abuse Coquette endured within those walls. We see her locked in a dark basement, isolated and punished for speaking her native language. These scenes felt off because they were so far removed from the cozy brand of Anne of Green Gables. Many viewers, especially those outside of Canada, were shocked to learn that these schools weren't just a fictional invention for the show, they were a systemic reality that lasted for over 100 years. By putting a face and a name to this tragedy, the show forced the audience to realize that while Anne was finding her home and her family at Green Gables, children just like her were being systematically stripped of theirs just a few miles away. The most stood-out aspect of this storyline, however, is its lack of a happy ending. In a typical Anne story, the plucky heroine usually finds a way to save the day through her wit and determination. But when Matthew and Anne travel to the school to try and rescue Coquette, they are met with the cold, hard wall of the law. They are told that they have no right to the girl, and Matthew is physically threatened when he tries to intervene. The image of Coquette's parents camped out in the woods across from the school, powerless to reach their own daughter, is perhaps the most haunting image in the entire series. It felt different because it broke the rules of television. The good guys didn't win. The child wasn't saved. And the credits rolled on a tragedy that was still very much in progress. There is a massive fan theory that this specific storyline is the real reason the show was cancelled. While the official line involves a breakdown in negotiations between the CBC and Netflix, many believe the show became too hot to handle because it was delving so deeply into the history of the Canadian government's treatment of the Mi'kmaq people. Whether or not that's true, the impact of these scenes is undeniable. They turned a whimsical period piece into a vital social commentary. They showed that the shining waters of Prince Edward Island were built on a foundation of displacement and pain. By including Coquette, the show gave a voice to the children of history, ensuring that their story could no longer be ignored, even if it meant the show had to end before it was finished. Another kind of secret was brewing, one that challenged the very definition of what it meant to belong. The forbidden love, Cole Mackenzie, and LGBTQ+ identity. In the original source material, Avonlea was a place where everyone fit into a very specific, traditional box. You were either a farmer, a housewife, or a student. There was no room for otherness, and if it existed, it was never spoken of. Enter Cole Mackenzie, a character created specifically for the Netflix series who became the heartbeat of the show's social themes. Cole is a sensitive, artistic boy who clearly doesn't fit the hyper-masculine expectations of the 1890s. His journey into self-discovery and the underground world he eventually finds provided a lens into a reality that Lucy Maud Montgomery likely could never have published in 1908. The most controversial feeling scenes in this arc revolve around the Aunt Josephine parties. In a complete departure from the books, Aunt Josephine Barry, the wealthy, stern relative of Diana, is revealed to be a woman who lived her entire life in a Boston marriage, a period-accurate term for two women living together in a romantic partnership. When she throws an extravagant party at her mansion in Charlottetown, she invites a hidden community of artists, queer people, and bohemians. For Cole, walking into that room was like walking into a sanctuary he didn't know existed. For the audience, it was a strong look at the secret queer history of the Victorian era. The scene where Cole finally realizes he isn't broken, but simply different, is one of the most emotional moments in the series, but it was also one that drew significant backlash from traditionalist fans who felt it was pushing a modern agenda onto a classic story. The conflict reaches a boiling point back in Avonlea through the character of Mr. Phillips, the school teacher. In a brilliant but uncomfortable twist, the show hints that Mr. Phillips' extreme cruelty toward Cole is actually a form of projection, that the teacher himself is a closeted man struggling with his own forbidden desires. This adds a layer of psychological complexity that was entirely absent from the books. The scene where Mr. Phillips confronts Cole is dripping with tension and unspoken subtext. It highlights the danger of being different in a small town. To the residents of Avonlea, the idea of a boy who preferred art to farming and who didn't want to marry a girl was more than just a quirk. It was a threat to their way of life. What makes Cole's storyline so powerful is that it provides a safe harbor for Anne's own radical ideas. Anne immediately recognizes Cole as a kindred spirit, not because she fully understands his identity, but because she knows what it's like to be an outsider. Their friendship becomes an alliance against the rigid norms of the town. When Cole eventually decides to leave Avonlea to live with Aunt Josephine in the city, it feels like a bittersweet escape. He is choosing to live in the margins of society where he can be himself, rather than suffocate in the perfect world of Green Gables. This subplot was a major love it or hate it moment for the fandom. For many, it was a beautiful, long overdue inclusion that reflected the reality that LGBTQ+ people have always existed, even in 1890s Prince Edward Island. For others, it felt like the fruit that soured the wholesome nature of the original work. Regardless of where you stand, there is no denying that these scenes pushed the boundaries of what an Anne adaptation could be. They took the subtext of the books, the themes of belonging and being different, and made them explicit, daring the audience to accept a version of the past that was far more diverse and complicated than the history books usually allow. It wasn't just the people or the politics that felt different this time around. The very air in Avonlea seemed thicker, colder, and far less poetic than we were ever led to believe. The grit factor. When we think of Anne of Green Gables, we usually imagine a soft focus world of sun-drenched hayfields, crisp white aprons, and the smell of baking bread. It's a comfort brand, designed to make us feel safe. But the Netflix series took that comfort and threw it out into the frozen Atlantic. The grit factor of Anne with an E was perhaps the most forbidden change of all, because it didn't just change a plot point, it changed the very soul of the setting. Suddenly, Avonlea wasn't a postcard. It was a cold, muddy, and often unforgiving place to survive. This tonal shift made the series feel like a banned version of the story that had finally been unearthed, showing us the reality that the previous, more sanitized versions had worked so hard to hide. The visual language of the show was the first thing that felt forbidden. In the 1985 version, Anne's hair was always perfectly coiffed, and her dresses, while simple, were always clean. In the Netflix version, we see the dirt under her fingernails. We see the chapped skin on her face from the biting Canadian winters. There are scenes of the physical labor required to run a farm like Green Gables, the heavy lifting, the blood from a slaughtered animal, and the constant, grinding exhaustion. This wasn't cottagecore aesthetic. It was survival. For many viewers, seeing the ugly side of farm life felt like a betrayal of the fantasy. It was as if the showrunners were saying, "You want to live in the 1890s? This is what it actually feels like." This grit extended to the way the characters interacted with their environment. In the books, the Lake of Shining Waters is a place of pure poetry. In the show, it's a place where characters can drown, where the water is cold, and where the beauty is often overshadowed by the harshness of the elements. The show spent a lot of time focusing on the economic anxiety of the Cuthberts, the fear that they might lose their home because they are getting too old to work the land. This added a layer of stress that was never present in the whimsical world of the novels. It made the stakes feel real, but it also made the show feel much less like a children's story and more like a historical drama about the working poor. The grit factor also applied to the social hierarchy of the town. We see the divide between the wealthy families like the Barrys and the poor families like the Cuthberts and the Andrews. The show highlights the classism that was rampant at the time, showing how Anne's status as a charity girl wasn't just a label, it was a social prison. The scenes where Anne is treated like a second-class citizen by the adults of the town are painful to watch because they strip away the idea that Avonlea was a community of kindred spirits. It was a community of people who were terrified of losing their status and who used their wholesome values as a weapon against anyone who was different. This grit is why the show felt so prohibited to the traditionalist. It refused to indulge in nostalgia. It took a beloved piece of Canadian mythology and deconstructed it, showing the gears and the grease underneath the clockwork. By making the world feel dangerous, dirty, and difficult, The showrunners made Anne's optimism feel like a hard-won victory rather than a default setting. It was a bold experiment in storytelling that proved that even the most cherished stories can benefit from a little bit of mud on their hem. As the dust and the dirt settles on this reimagined Avonlea, we're left to wonder if the version was actually the one we needed all along. Ultimately, was Anne with an E truly forbidden, or was it simply too honest for a world that prefers its nostalgia sugar-coated? By peeling back the layers of Victorian politeness, the series transformed a whimsical childhood staple into a mirror for our own modern struggles. It dared to go where the original books couldn't, tackling the jagged edges of trauma, the sting of social exclusion, and the heavy silence of suppressed history. While traditionalists might still cringe at the sight of dirt under Anne's fingernails or the mention of systemic injustice, these scandalous additions gave the story a new, vital heartbeat. The show was cancelled, but its legacy remains untouched, a bold, gritty, and beautiful reminder that even the most perfect stories have shadows worth exploring. Whether we like it or not, this version of Anne Shirley proved that the truth is rarely pure and never simple, but it is always worth telling. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more and leave your comments if you liked Anne with an E in general.